Section 1 of Reminiscences of Captain Gronow. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Reminiscences of Captain Gronow by Captain Rees, Howell, Gronow. Section 1. Reminiscences of Captain Gronow, formerly of the Grenadier Guards and MP for Stafford, being anecdotes of the camp, the court, and the clubs at the close of the last war with France, related by himself. O friends regretted, scenes for ever dear, Remembrance hails you with her warmest tear. Drooping she bends o'er pensive fancy's urn, To trace the hours which never can return. A few words to the reader. It has been my lot to have lived through the greater part of one of the most eventful centuries of England's history, and I have been thrown amongst most of the remarkable men of my day, whether soldiers, statesmen, men of letters, theatrical people, or those whose birth and fortune, rather perhaps than their virtues or talents, have caused them to be conspicuous in society at home or abroad. Nature having endowed me with a strong memory, I can recall, with all their original vividness, scenes that took place 50 years ago, and distinctly recollect the face, walk, and voice, as well as the dress and general manner, of every one whom I have known. I have frequently repeated to my friends what I have seen and heard since the year that I joined the Guards, 1813, and have been urged to commit to paper my anecdotes and reminiscences. Unfortunately, I have not the power of efficiently describing in words the pictures that are hung up in the long gallery of my memory. A man may see very distinctly the landscape before him, yet he may be unable to delineate that which he gazes upon and is intimately acquainted with. A viva voce narrative of an incident told to a friend in conversation may pass muster, and one is able to fill up any gaps in an imperfect description. But it always occurred to me that I had no right to task a reader's time and patience unless I could put before him what I had to say in a lucid and complete form. I therefore refrained from committing myself to print. I have at length, however, yielded to the suggestion of friends, and written down some anecdotes in the best way I could. Soldiers are not generally famous for literary excellence, and when I was young, the military man was, perhaps, much less a scholar than he is at the present day, but I hope that the interest of the matter will make up for any deficiency of style. In going over more than half a century, and treating of men, women, and events, it was necessary to leave out many anecdotes which would, perhaps, have been more interesting than most of those that I have given, for I would not willingly offend or hurt the feelings of any one, and I wish to respect the memory of the dead, as well as to take into consideration the sensitiveness of the living. My reminiscences, it will be seen, are nothing more than miniature illustrations of contemporary history, and though the reader may find here and there scraps of biographical matter, I confine myself to facts and characteristics which were familiar to the circle in which I moved, and perhaps are as much public property as the painted portraits of celebrities. Should this work meet with the approbation of the public, I hope at a future time to publish an additional one, as my memory still serves me with sufficient materials for another volume of a similar kind. R. H. Gronow. My entrance into the army. After leaving Eton, I received an ensign's commission in the 1st Guards during the month of December 1812. Though many years have elapsed, I still remember my boyish delight at being named to so distinguished a regiment, and at the prospect of soon taking part in the glorious deeds of our army in Spain. I joined in February 1813, and cannot but recollect with astonishment how limited and imperfect was the instruction which an officer received at that time. he absolutely entered the army without any military education whatever. We were so defective in our drill, even after we had passed out of the hands of the sergeant, that the excellence of our non-commissioned officers alone prevented us from meeting with the most fatal disasters in the face of the enemy. Physical force and our bulldog energy carried many a hard-fought field. Luckily nous avons changé tout cela, and our officers may now vie with those of any other army in an age when the great improvements in musketry, in artillery practice, and in the greater rapidity of manoeuvring, have entirely changed the art of war, and rendered the individual education of those in every grade of command an absolute necessity. After passing through the hands of the drill sergeant, with my friends Dashwood, Batty, Brown, Lascelles, Hume, and Masters, and mounting guard at St. James's for a few months, we were hurried off one fine morning, in charge of a splendid detachment of 500 men, to join Lord Wellington in Spain. Macadam had just begun to do for England what Marshal Wade did in Scotland 70 years before, and we were able to march 20 miles a day with ease until we reached Portsmouth. There we found transports ready to convey a large reinforcement, of which we formed part, to Lord Wellington, who was now making his arrangements, after taking St. Sebastian, for a yet more important event in the history of the Peninsular War, the invasion of France. Departure for and arrival in Spain. We sailed under convoy of the Madagascar frigate, commanded by Captain Curtis, and after a favourable voyage we arrived at Passage. Our stay there was short, for we were ordered to join the army without loss of time. In 3 hours we got fairly into camp, where we were received with loud cheers by our brothers in arms. The whole British army was here under canvas, our allies, the Spaniards and Portuguese, being in the rear. About the middle of October, to our great delight, the army received orders to cross the Bidassoa. At 3 o'clock on the morning of the 15th, our regiment advanced through a difficult country, and after a harassing march, reached the top of a hill as the grey light of morning began to dawn. We marched in profound silence, but with a pleasurable feeling of excitement amongst all ranks at the thought of meeting the enemy, and perhaps with not an equally agreeable idea that we might be in the next world before the day was over. As we ascended the rugged side of the hill, I saw for the first time the immortal Wellington. He was accompanied by the Spanish General Alava, Lord Fitzroy Somerset, and Major, afterwards Colonel, Freemantle. He was very stern and grave looking. He was in deep meditation so long as I kept him in view, and spoke to no one. His features were bold, and I saw much decision of character in his expression. He rode a knowing-looking thoroughbred horse, and wore a grey overcoat, Hessian boots, and a large cocked hat. We commenced the passage of the Bidassoa about 5 in the morning, and in a short time infantry, cavalry, and artillery found themselves upon French ground. The stream at the point we forded was nearly 4 feet deep, and had Soult been aware of what we were about, we should have found the passage of the river a very arduous undertaking. 3 miles above we discovered the French army, and ere long found ourselves under fire. The sensation of being made a target to a large body of men is at first not particularly pleasant, but in a trice the ear becomes more Irish and less nice. The first man I ever saw killed was a Spanish soldier who was cut in two by a cannon ball. The French army, not long after we began to return their fire, was in full retreat, and after a little sharp but desultory fighting, in which our division met with some loss, we took possession of the camp and strong position of Soult's army. We found the soldiers' huts very comfortable. They were built of branches of trees and firs, and formed squares and streets which had names placarded up, such as Rue de Paris, Rue de Versailles, etc. We were not sorry to find ourselves in such commodious quarters, as well as being well housed. The scenery surrounding the camp was picturesque and grand. From our elevated position immediately in front, we commanded a wide and extensive plain, intersected by two important rivers, the Nive and the Nivelle. On the right, the lofty Pyrenees, with their grand and varied outline, stood forth conspicuously in a blue cloudless sky. On our left was the Bay of Biscay, with our cruisers perpetually on the move. We witnessed from the camp, one night about 12 o'clock, a fight at sea between an English brig and a French corvette, which was leaving the Adour with provisions and ammunition. She was chased by the brig and brought to action. The night was sufficiently clear to enable us to discover distinctly the position of the vessels and the measured flash of their guns. They were at close quarters, and in less than half an hour we discovered the crew of the corvette taking to their boats. Shortly afterwards the vessel blew up with a loud explosion. We came to the conclusion that sea fighting was more agreeable than land fighting, as the crews of the vessels engaged without previous heavy marching, and with loose light clothing. There was no manoeuvring, or standing for hours on the defensive. The wounded were immediately taken below and attended to, and the whole affair was over in a pleasingly brief period. The uniform and bearing of the French soldier. The French infantry soldier averaged about 5 feet 5 or 6 in height. In build they were much about what they are now, perhaps a little broader over the shoulder. They were smart, active, handy fellows, and much more able to look after their personal comforts than British soldiers, as their camps indicated. The uniform of those days consisted in a shako, which spread out at the top, a short-waisted, swallow-tailed coat, and large baggy trousers and gaiters. The clothing of the French soldier was roomy, and enabled him to march and move about at ease. No pipe-clay accessories occupied their attention. In a word, their uniforms and accoutrements were infinitely superior to our own, taking into consideration the practical necessities of warfare. Their muskets were inferior to ours, and their firing less deadly. The French cavalry we thought badly horsed, but their uniforms, though showy, were, like those of the infantry, comfortably large and roomy. I have frequently remarked that firearms are of little use to the mounted soldier, and often an encumbrance to man and horse. Cavalry want only one arm, the sabre. Let the men be well mounted and at home in the saddle. It requires great knowledge in a commander-in-chief to know when and how to use his cavalry. It has been my misfortune to witness oft-repeated blunders in the employment of the best mounted regiments in the world. I consider the French generals had more knowledge of the use of cavalry than our own, when a great battle was to be fought. Major General Stuart and Lord Wellington. If the present generation of Englishmen would take the trouble of looking at the newspaper which 50 years ago informed the British public of passing events both at home and abroad, they would doubtless marvel at the very limited and imperfect amount of intelligence which the best journals were enabled to place before their readers. The progress of the Peninsular campaign was very imperfectly chronicled. It will therefore be easily imagined what interest was attached to certain letters that appeared in the Morning Chronicle, which criticised with much severity, and frequently with considerable injustice, the military movements of Lord Wellington's Spanish campaign. The attention of the Commander-in-Chief being drawn to these periodical and personal comments on his conduct of the war, his lordship at once perceived from the information which they contained that they must have been written by an officer holding a high command under him. Determined to ascertain the author, who in addressing a public journal was violating the articles of war, and, it might be, assisting the enemy, means were employed in London to identify the writer. The result was that Lord Wellington discovered the author of the letters to be no other than Sir Charles Stuart, the late Lord Londonderry. As soon as Lord Wellington had made himself master of this fact, he summoned Sir Charles Stewart to headquarters at Torres Vedras, and on his appearance, he, without the least preface, addressed him thus: "Charles Stewart, I have ascertained with deep regret that you are the author of the letters which appeared in the Morning Chronicle, abusing me and finding fault with my military plans." Lord Wellington paused here for a moment, and then continued: "Now, Stewart, you know your brother Castlereagh is my best friend, to whom I owe everything. Nevertheless, if you continue to write letters to the Chronicle, or any other newspaper, by God, I will send you home." Sir Charles Stewart was so affected at this rebuke that he shed tears, and expressed himself deeply penitent for the breach of confidence and want of respect for the articles of war. They immediately shook hands and parted friends. It happened, however, that Sir Charles Stewart did not remain long in the cavalry, of which he was adjutant general. Within a few weeks he was named one of the commissioners deputed to proceed to the allied armies, where the sovereigns were then completing their plans to crush Napoleon. Saint-Jean-de-Luz. During the winter of 1813, the Guards were stationed with headquarters at Saint-Jean-de-Luz, and most comfortable we managed to make them. For some short time previously we had been on scanty commons, and had undergone considerable privation. Indeed, we might have said, like the Colonel to Johnny Newcome on his arrival to join his regiment, "We sons of Mars have long been fed on brandy and cigars." I had no cause to complain personally, for my servant, a Sicilian, was one of the most accomplished foragers (ill-natured persons might give him a worse name) in the whole army, and when others were nearly starving, he always managed to provide meat or poultry. He rode on his mule sometimes from 20 to 30 miles, often running the greatest dangers, to procure me a good meal, of which he took care to have, very justly, a large share for himself. At Saint-Jean-de-Luz we were more attentive to our devotions than we had been for some time. Divine service was performed punctually every Sunday on the sandhills near the town. Lord Wellington and his numerous staff placed themselves in the midst of our square, and his lordship's chaplain read the service, to which Lord Wellington always appeared to listen with great attention. The mayor of the town, thinking to please the great English lord, gave a ball at the Hôtel de Ville. Our commander in chief did not go, but was represented by Waters. I was there, and expected to see some of the young ladies of the country so famed for their beauty. They were, however, far too patriotic to appear, and the only lady present was Lady Waldegrave, then living with her husband at headquarters. What was one partner among so many? The ball was a dead failure, in spite of the efforts of the mayor, who danced, to our intense amusement, an English hornpipe, which he had learned in a not very agreeable manner, viz. When a prisoner of war in the hulks at Plymouth. There were 2 packs of hounds at Saint-Jean-de-Luz, one kept by Lord Wellington, the other by Marsden of the Commissariat. Our officers went uncommonly straight. Perhaps our best man across country, though sometimes somewhat against his will, was the late Colonel Lascelles of my regiment, then, like myself, a mere lad. He rode a horse 17 hands high, called Bucephalus, which invariably ran away with him, and more than once had nearly capsized Lord Wellington. The good living at Saint-Jean-de-Luz agreed so well with my friend that he waxed fat, and from that period to his death was known to the world by the jovial appellation of Bacchus Lascelles. Shortly before we left Saint-Jean-de-Luz, we took our turn of outposts in the neighbourhood of Bidart, a large village about 10 miles from Bayonne. Early one frosty morning in December, an order came that if we saw the enemy advancing, we were not to fire or give the alarm. About 5 we perceived 2 battalions wearing grenadier caps coming on. They turned out to belong to a Nassau regiment which had occupied the advanced post of the enemy, and hearing that Napoleon had met with great reverses in Germany, signified to us their intention to desert. They were a fine looking body of men, and appeared, I thought, rather ashamed of the step they had taken. On the same day we were relieved, and on our way back met Lord Wellington with his hounds. He was dressed in a light blue frock coat, the colour of the Hatfield hunt, which had been sent out to him as a present from Lady Salisbury, then one of the leaders of the fashionable world, and an enthusiastic admirer of his lordship. Here I remember seeing for the first time a very remarkable character, the Hon. W. Dawson, of my regiment. He was surrounded by muleteers, with whom he was bargaining to provide carriage for innumerable hampers of wine, liqueurs, hams, potted meat, and other good things which he had brought from England. He was a particularly gentlemanly and amiable man, much beloved by the regiment. No one was so hospitable, or lived so magnificently. His cooks were the best in the army, and he, besides, had a host of servants of all nations, Spaniards, French, Portuguese, Italians, who were employed in scouring the country for provisions. Lord Wellington once honoured him with his company, and on entering the ensign's tent found him alone at table, with a dinner fit for a king, his plate and linen in good keeping, and his wines perfect. Lord Wellington was accompanied on this occasion by Sir Edward Pakenham and Colonel du Burgh, afterwards Lord Downes. It fell to my lot to partake of his princely hospitality, and dine with him at his quarters, a farmhouse in a village on the Bidassoa, and I never saw a better dinner put upon table. The career of this amiable amphitryon, to our great regret, was cut short, after exercising for about a year a splendid but not very wise hospitality. He had only a younger brother's fortune; his debts became very considerable, and he was obliged to quit the Guards. He and his friends had literally eaten up his little fortune. Foolhardiness. I may here recount an instance of the folly and foolhardiness of youth, and the recklessness to which a long course of exposure to danger produces. When Bayonne was invested, I was one night on duty on the outer picket. The ground inside the breastwork, which had been thrown up for our protection by Burgoyne, was in a most disagreeable state for any one who wished to repose after the fatigues of the day, being knee deep in mud of a remarkably plastic nature. I was dead tired, and determined to get a little rest in some more agreeable spot; so calling my sergeant, I told him to give me his knapsack for a pillow. I would make a comfortable night of it on top of the breastwork, as it was an invitingly dry place. "For heaven's sake, take care, sir," said he; "you'll have 50 bullets in you; you will be killed to a certainty." "Pooh, nonsense!" said I, and climbing up, I wrapped myself in my cloak, laid my head on the knapsack, and soon fell into a sound sleep. By the mercy of Providence I remained in a whole skin, either from the French immediately underneath not perceiving me, or not thinking me worth a shot. But when General Stopford came up with Lord James Hay, who not long since reminded me of this youthful escapade, I received a severe wigging, and was told to consider myself lucky that I was not put under arrest for exposing my life in so foolish a manner. Among the many officers of the Guards who were taken prisoners in the unfortunate sortie from Bayonne was the Hon. H. Townshend, commonly called Bull Townshend. He was celebrated as a bon vivant, and in consequence of his too great indulgence in the pleasures of the table, had become very unwieldy, and could not move quick enough to please his nimble captors, so he received many prods in the back from a sharp bayonet. After repeated threats, however, he was dismissed with what our American friends would be pleased to designate a severe booting. The late Sir Willoughby Cotton was also a prisoner. It really seemed as if the enemy had made choice of our fattest officers. Sir Willoughby escaped by giving up his watch and all the money which he had in his pockets; but this consisting of a Spanish dollar only, the smallness of the sum subjected him to the same ignominious treatment as had been experienced by Townshend. Among the numerous bad characters in our ranks, several were coiners, or utterers of bad money. In the 2nd Brigade of Guards, just before we arrived at St. Jean de Luz, a soldier was convicted of this offence, and was sentenced to receive 800 lashes. This man made sham Spanish dollars out of the pewter spoons of the regiment. As he had before been convicted and flogged, he received this terrible sentence, and died under the lash. Would it not have been better to have condemned him to be shot? It would have been more humane, certainly more military, and far less brutal. Discipline. When the headquarters of the army were at Saint-Jean-de-Luz, Soult made a movement in front of our right centre, which the English general took for a reconnaissance. As the French general perceived that we had ordered preparations to receive him, he sent a flag of truce to demand a cessation of hostilities, saying that he wanted to shoot an officer and several men for acts of robbery committed by them with every sort of atrocity on the farmers and peasantry of the country. The execution took place in view of both armies, and a terrible lesson it was. I cannot specify the date of this event, but think it must have been the latter end of November 1813. About the same time, General Rees, who commanded a corps of Basques, issued a proclamation forbidding the peasantry to supply the English with provisions or forage, on pain of death. It stated that we were savages, and as a proof of this our horses were born with short tails. I saw this absurd proclamation, which was published in French and in the Basque languages, and distributed all over the country. Before we left the neighbourhood of Bayonne for Bordeaux, a soldier was hanged for robbery on the sands of the Adour. This sort of punishment astonished the French almost as much as it did the soldier. On a march we were very severe, and if any of our men were caught committing an act of violence or brigandage, the offender was tried by a drumhead court-martial, and hanged in a very short time. I knew an officer of the 18th Hussars, W.R., young, rich, and a fine-looking fellow, who joined the army not far from Saint Sebastian. His stud of horses was remarkable for their blood. His grooms were English, and 3 in number. He brought with him a light cart to carry forage, and a fourgon for his own baggage. All went on well till he came to go on outpost duty; but not finding there any of the comforts to which he had been accustomed, he quietly mounted his charger, told his astonished sergeant that campaigning was not intended for a gentleman, and instantly galloped off to his quarters, ordering his servants to pack up everything immediately, as he had hired a transport to take him off to England. He left us before any one had time to stop him, and though dispatches were sent off to the commander-in-chief, requesting that a court-martial might sit to try the young deserter, he arrived home long enough before the dispatches to enable him to sell out of his regiment. He deserved to have been shot. Sir John Hope, who commanded our corps d'armée at Bayonne, had his quarters at a village on the Adour, called Beaucaux. He was good enough to name me to the command of the village, which honour I did not hold for many days, for the famous sortie from Bayonne took place soon after, and the general was made prisoner. Sir John Waters. Amongst the distinguished men in the Peninsular War whom my memory brings occasionally before me, is the well-known and highly popular quartermaster, General Sir John Waters, who was born at Margam, a Welsh village in Glamorganshire. He was one of those extraordinary persons that seem created by kind nature for particular purposes; and without using the word in an offensive sense, he was the most admirable spy that was ever attached to an army. One would almost have thought that the Spanish war was entered upon and carried on in order to display his remarkable qualities. He could assume the character of Spaniards of every degree and station, so as to deceive the most acute of those whom he delighted to imitate. In the posada of the village he was hailed by the contrabandist or the muleteer as one of their own race. In the gay assemblies he was an accomplished hidalgo. At the bull-fight the toreador received his congratulations as from one who had encountered the toro in the arena. In the church he would converse with the friar upon the number of Ave Marias and Paternosters which could lay a ghost, or tell him the story of every one who had perished by the flame of the Inquisition, relating his crime, whether carnal or anti-Catholic; and he could join in the seguadilla, or the guaracha. But what rendered him more efficient than all was his wonderful power of observation and accurate description, which made the information he gave so reliable and valuable to the Duke of Wellington. Nothing escaped him. When amidst a group of persons, he would minutely watch the movement, attitude, and expression of every individual that composed it. In the scenery by which he was surrounded, he would carefully mark every object. Not a tree, not a bush, not a large stone escaped his observation. And it was said that in a cottage he noted every piece of crockery on the shelf, every domestic utensil, and even the number of knives and forks that were got ready for use at dinner. His acquaintance with the Spanish language was marvellous. From the finest works of Calderon to the ballads in the patois of every province he could quote, to the infinite delight of those with whom he associated. He could assume any character that he pleased. He could be the Castilian, haughty and reserved; the Asturian, stupid and plodding; the Catalonian, intriguing and cunning; the Andalusian, laughing and merry. In short, he was all things to all men. Nor was he incapable of passing off, when occasion required, for a Frenchman; but as he spoke the language with a strong German accent, he called himself an Alsatian. He maintained that character with the utmost nicety; and as there is a strong feeling of fellowship, almost equal to that which exists in Scotland, amongst all those who are born in the departments of France bordering on the Rhine, and who maintain their Teutonic originality, he always found friends and supporters in every regiment in the French service. He was on one occasion entrusted with a very difficult mission by the Duke of Wellington, which he undertook effectually to perform, and to return on a particular day with the information that was required. Great was the disappointment when it was ascertained beyond a doubt that just after leaving the camp he had been taken prisoner, before he had time to exchange his uniform. Such, however, was the case. A troop of dragoons had intercepted him and carried him off, and the commanding officer desired 2 soldiers to keep a strict watch over him and carry him to headquarters. He was, of course, disarmed, and being placed on a horse, was, after a short time, galloped off by his guards. He slept one night under durance vile at a small inn, where he was allowed to remain in the kitchen. Conversation flowed on very glibly, and as he appeared a stupid Englishman, who could not understand a word of French or Spanish, he was allowed to listen, and thus obtained precisely the intelligence that he was in search of. The following morning, being again mounted, he overheard a conversation between his guards, who deliberately agreed to rob him, and to shoot him at a mill where they were to stop, and to report to their officer that they had been compelled to fire at him in consequence of his attempt to escape. Shortly before they arrived at the mill, for fear that they might meet with some one who would insist on having a portion of the spoil, the dragoons took from the prisoner his watch and his purse, which he surrendered with a good grace. On their arrival at the mill they dismounted, and in order to give some appearance of truth to their story, they went into the house, leaving their prisoner outside, in the hope that he would make some attempt to escape. In an instant Waters threw his cloak upon a neighbouring olive bush, and mounted his cocked hat on the top. Some empty flour sacks lay upon the ground, and a horse, laden with well-filled flour sacks, stood at the door. Sir John contrived to enter one of the empty sacks, and throw himself across the horse. When the soldiers came out of the house, they fired their carbines at the supposed prisoner, and galloped off at their utmost speed. A short time after, the miller came out and mounted his steed. the general contrived to rid himself of the encumbrance of the sack, and sat up, riding behind the man, who, suddenly turning round, saw a ghost, as he believed, for the flour that still remained in the sack had completely whitened his fellow traveller, and given him a most unearthly appearance. The frightened miller was putrified, as Mrs. Malaprop would say, at the sight, and a push from the white spectre brought the unfortunate man to the ground, when away rode the gallant quartermaster with his sacks of flour, which at length bursting, made a ludicrous spectacle of man and horse. On reaching the English camp, where Lord Wellington was anxiously deploring his fate, a sudden shout from the soldiers made his lordship turn round, when a figure resembling the statue in Don Juan galloped up to him. The Duke, affectionately shaking him by the hand, said, "Waters, you never yet deceived me, and though you have come in a most questionable shape, I must congratulate you and myself." When this story was told at the clubs, one of those listeners who always want something more called out, "Well, and what did Waters say?" To which Alvanley replied, "Oh, Waters made a very flowery speech, like a well-bred man." The Battle of the Nivelle. We expected to remain quietly in our winter quarters at Saint-Jean-de-Luz, but to our surprise, early one morning, we were aroused from sleep by the beating of the drum calling us to arms. We were soon in marching order. It appeared that our outposts had been severely pushed by the French, and we were called upon to support our companions in arms. The whole of the British army, as well as the division of the Guards, had commenced a forward movement. Soult, seeing this, entirely changed his tactics, and from that time, viz. the 9th of December, a series of engagements took place. The fighting on the 9th was comparatively insignificant. When we were attacked on the 10th, the Guards held the mayor's house and the grounds and orchard attached. This was an important station. Large bodies of the enemy's infantry approached, and after desultory fighting succeeded in penetrating our position, when many hand-to-hand combats ensued. Towards the afternoon, officers and men having displayed great gallantry, we drove the enemy from the ground which they courageously disputed with us, and from which they eventually retreated to Bayonne. Every day there was constant fighting along the whole of our line, which extended from the sea to the Lower Pyrenees, a distance probably not less than 30 miles. On the 11th we only exchanged a few shots, but on the 12th Soult brought into action from 15 to 20,000 men, and attacked our left with a view of breaking our line. One of the most remarkable incidents of the 12th was the fact of an English battalion being surrounded by a division of French in the neighbourhood of the mayor's house, which, as before observed, was one of our principal strategical positions. The French commanding officer, believing that no attempt would be made to resist, galloped up to the officer of the British regiment and demanded his sword. Upon this, without the least hesitation, the British officer shouted out, "This fellow wants us to surrender! Charge, my boys, and show 'em what stuff we're made of!" Instantaneously a hearty cheer rang out, and our men rushed forward impetuously, drove off the enemy at the point of the bayonet, and soon disposed of the surrounding masses. In a few minutes they had taken prisoners or killed the whole of the infantry regiment opposed to them. On the 13th was fought the bloody battle of the Nivelle. Soult had determined to make a gigantic effort to drive us back into Spain. During the night of the 12th he rapidly concentrated about 60,000 troops in front of Sir Rowland Hill's corps d'armée, consisting of 15,000 men, who occupied a very strong position, which was defended by some of the best artillery in the world. At daybreak Sir Rowland Hill was astonished to find himself threatened by masses of infantry advancing over a country luckily intersected by rivulets, hedges, and woods, which prevented the enemy from making a rapid advance, whilst at the same time it was impossible on such ground to employ cavalry. Sir Rowland, availing himself of an elevated position, hurriedly surveyed his ground, and concentrated his men at such points as he knew the nature of the field would induce the enemy to attack. The French, confident of success from their superior numbers, came gallantly up, using the bayonet for the first time in a premeditated attack. Our men stood their ground, and for hours acted purely on the defensive, being sustained by the admirable practice of our artillery, whose movements no difficulty of ground could on this occasion impede, so efficiently were the guns horsed, and so perfect was the training of the officers. It was not until midday that the enemy became discouraged at finding that they were unable to make any serious impression on our position. They then retired in good order, Sir Rowland Hill not daring to follow them. Lord Wellington arrived just in time to witness the end of the battle, and while going over the field with Sir Rowland Hill, he remarked that he had never seen so many men hors de combat in so small a space. I must not omit to mention a circumstance which occurred during this great fight, alike illustrative of cowardice and of courage. The colonel of an infantry regiment, who shall be nameless, being hard pressed, showed a disposition not only to run away himself, but to order his regiment to retire. In fact, a retrograde movement had commenced, when my gallant and dear friend, Lord Charles Spencer, aide de camp to Sir William Stewart, dashed forward, and seizing the colours of the regiment, exclaimed, "If your colonel will not lead you, follow me, my boys." The gallantry of this youth, then only 18 years of age, so animated the regiment and restored their confidence, that they rallied and shared in the glory of the day. The passage of the Adour. Immediately after the battle of Nivelles, Lord Wellington determined to advance his whole line on to French ground. The right, under his own command, pushed on towards Orthez, whilst the left, under the command of Sir John Hope, proceeded in the direction of Bayonne. We, the Guards, were incorporated in the latter corps d'armée. Whilst these operations were going on, Soult was organising his discouraged army, in order to make, as early as possible, another convenient stand. The enemy fell back on Orthez, and there took up a strong position. Soult was, nevertheless, destined to be beaten again at Orthez. It so happened that, for the first time since the battle of Vittoria, our cavalry were engaged. The nature of the ground at Nives and Nivelles was such as to prevent the possibility of employing the mounted soldier. I must here record an incident which created a considerable sensation in military circles in connection with the battle of Orthez. The 10th Hussars, officered exclusively by men belonging to the noblest families of Great Britain, showed a desire to take a more active part in the contest than their colonel, Quintin, thought prudent. They pressed hard to be permitted to charge the French cavalry on more than one occasion, but in vain. This so disgusted every officer in the regiment that they eventually signed a round robin, by which they agreed never again to speak to their colonel. When the regiment returned to England, a court of inquiry was held, which resulted, through the protection of the Prince Regent, in the colonel's exoneration from all blame, and at the same time the exchange of the rebellious officers into other regiments. It was at the battle of Orthez that the late Duke of Richmond was shot through the body, gallantly fighting with the 7th Fusiliers. Lord Wellington had determined to cross the Adour, and Sir John Hope was entrusted with a corps d'armée which was the first to perform this difficult operation. It was necessary to provide Sir John Hope with a number of small boats. These were accordingly brought on the backs of mules from various Spanish ports, it being impossible, on account of the surf at the entrance of the Adour, as well as the command which the French held of that river, for Lord Wellington to avail himself of water carriage. Soult had given orders for the forces under General Thevenot to dispute the passage. The first operations of our corps were to throw over the 3rd Guards under the command of the gallant Colonel Stopford. This was not accomplished without much difficulty, but it was imperatively necessary in order to protect the point where the construction of the bridge of boats would terminate. They had not been long on the French side of the river before a considerable body of men were seen issuing from Bayonne. Sir John Hope ordered our artillery and rockets, then for the first time employed, to support our small band. 3 or 4 regiments of French infantry were approaching rapidly, when a well-directed fire of rockets fell amongst them. The consternation of the Frenchmen was such, when these hissing, serpent-like projectiles descended, that a panic ensued, and they retreated upon Bayonne. The next day the bridge of boats was completed, and the whole army crossed. Bayonne was eventually invested after a contest in which it was supposed our loss exceeded 500 or 600 men. Here we remained in camp about 6 weeks, expecting to besiege the citadel, but this event never came off. We, however, met with a severe disaster and a reverse. The enemy made an unexpected sortie, and surrounded General Sir John Hope, when he and the whole of his staff were taken prisoners. The French killed and wounded about 1,000 men on this occasion. The hardly contested battle of Toulouse was fought about this period, but the Guards were not present to share the honours of a contest which closed the eventful war of the Spanish Peninsula. Arrival of the Guards at Bordeaux. When we reached Bordeaux, which had now become a stronghold of the Royalists, we were received by the inhabitants with a welcome which resembled what would be shown to friends and deliverers rather than to a foreign soldiery. Nothing could be more gratifying and more acceptable to our feelings, since it was the first time after our arrival on the Continent that we met with cordiality and an apparent desire to make our quarters as comfortable as possible. The Duc d'Angoulême had reached Bordeaux before us, and no doubt his presence had prepared the way for all the friends of the Bourbons. Everywhere some description of white rag was doing duty for a royalist banner. I lived at Monsieur de Vignes, a rich wine merchant who had a family of 2 sons and 2 beautiful daughters. The latter were, as I thought, taken remarkable care of by their maternal parent. Here I had evidently fallen upon my legs, for not only was the family a most agreeable one, but their hospitality was of the most generous kind. Sir Stapleton Cotton was our frequent visitor, together with Monsieur Martignac, afterwards Minister of Charles X. Here I had an opportunity of meeting some of the prettiest women of a city famed all over Europe for its female beauty. The young ladies were remarkable for their taste in dress, which in those days consisted of a mantilla à l'Espagnole, and silken shawls of varied hues, so admirably blended that the eye was charmed with their richness of colour. The grisettes, who were as much admired by the soldiers as were the high dames by the officers, were remarkable for a coquettish species of apron of a red dye, which was only to be obtained from the neighbourhood. Of course we were all very anxious to taste the Bordeaux wines, but our palates, accustomed to the stronger vintages of Spain, I suspect were not in a condition to appreciate the more delicate and refined bouquet which ought to characterise claret. A vin ordinaire, which now at restaurateurs would cost 3 francs, was then furnished at the hotels for 15 sous. A La Rose, Lafitte, Margaux, such as we are now paying 8 or 10 francs a bottle for, did not cost a third. I must not, however, forget that greater attention and care is now employed in the preparation of French wines. The exportation to England of the light red wines of France was not sufficiently profitable, as I learned from my host, at that time, to attract the cupidity of commerce. In the Guards, Bordeaux was more affectionately remembered in connection with its women than its wine. We left it with regret. and the more youthful and imaginative amongst us said that we were wafted across the Channel by the gentle sighs of the girls we left behind us. Section 2. Recording by Ruth Golding.